That was a dumb question.
Yeah.
I
think
I would not.
That's too much.
I would not.
Okay.
No, he was like the one guy I knew at ESPN before I came there and felt like I could joke around with. But I don't know if you know this, but certain portions of the internet and social media don't really get jokes.
They don't get irony, yeah.
They don't get irony. They don't get subtlety. They don't get nuance. They don't get sarcasm. No, I mean, no.
Joe Buck just won the Ford C. Frick Award. The Hall of Fame put his name up there for keeps. He is one of the most recognized voices in baseball history. But before the honor came the damage, because this man sat behind that microphone and wrecked 7 major league players publicly on national television, one by one. And today we are going all in. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icon. Have you ever wondered why fans from nearly every baseball team say the exact same thing? They say Joe Buck hates their guys. Red Sox fans say it. Cardinals fans say it. Dodgers fans say it. Cubs fans say it. Indians fans say it. Giants fans say it too. How does one man make every single fan base feel personally attacked? That is not a small thing. That is not just internet noise. That is a real pattern. And in the world of professional sports, your reputation is everything. It takes years to build and just seconds to damage. When a national broadcaster with Joe Buck's reach tells 40 million viewers something about a player, that player does not get to defend himself in that moment. The story moves. And sometimes it never comes back. That is the thing about viral sports media. It always tells you a story. And the story sounds clean and simple. Joe Buck hates players. Fans hate Joe Buck. Buck calls everyone garbage. The internet runs with it. YouTube compilations get made. Subreddits blow up. And before long, millions of people believe something that is way more complicated than a simple label. The truth is that Buck has spent decades in that navigating something almost impossible. He is the face of the biggest games of the year. He calls World Series games, handles the Super Bowl, and no matter what he says, half the country is ready to tell him he got it dead wrong. This deep dive exists to lay out exactly what happened with 7 specific players, why fans felt the way they did, and whether or not Buck words actually crossed a line. If you enjoy breakdowns like this one, go ahead and hit the hype feature on this video right now. Put some hype so more people find it. Now, here is where the story gets real, because the word garbage in this whole conversation goes in both directions. Think about that for a second. Fans on Reddit and social media platforms constantly call Buck's home run calls hot garbage. They say he is garbage at baseball compared to football. That word gets thrown around constantly by the same people tune in for every single broadcast. But here is the flip side of it all. Buck has also used his national platform to call out what he feels destroys the game itself. During the fallout Houston Astros sign-stealing scandal, he went on air and made it very clear how he felt. He said there's systematic cheating destroys any idea of fair competition. So on one side, fans are calling Buck garbage the way he broadcasts. On the other side, Buck is labeling certain team actions as things destroy the integrity of the sport. That back and forth of garbage runs both directions, and it forms the core tension that drives this entire conversation. The title of this video is not random. The internet has been building this case against Buck for years. Online forums, YouTube clips, Reddit threads, they all point to specific moments where Buck's words hit players in a way that felt wrong. Not always wrong in a loud and obvious way. Sometimes it was subtle. A tone, a pause, a deliberate choice about which story to tell and ignore, because in national broadcasting, what you choose to focus on is just as powerful as the words you actually say out loud. The framing is the message. Buck had strong opinions about how the game should be played. He had a code, and when players did not fit that code, commentary reflected, sometimes clearly, sometimes quietly. But fans noticed, and they noticed for years, the evidence stacked up across fan bases, across teams, and across different eras of the sport. And when you look at it all together, a consistent picture from a broadcaster with a massive platform, a strong personal set of values, and a pattern of framing certain players in ways that local fans found deeply unfair. This is not about calling Buck a bad person. This is about understanding how power works in sports media. When you sit in the booth of a World Series game and tens of people are watching, your words are not just, they are the storyline of the night. They are what casual fans carry home. They are what becomes the permanent record. And Joe Buck understood better than anyone. He grew up in the business. He knew what his words were worth, why the moments where he used that platform to cut a player down carry so much weight, which is exactly why 7 players and their fan bases talk about it today. Some of those moments made sense. Others are much harder to defend. Let us get into all 7 of them right now. To fully understand the controversy, you need to know who Joe Buck actually is and how he got here. Joe Buck did not stumble one day and get lucky. He grew up inside the business. His father was Jack Buck, loved broadcast and baseball history, the longtime voice of the St. Cardinals. Joe was calling minor league games as a teenager. He called his first World Series at the age of 27. By the time he was 30, he had already called more championship-level games than most broadcasters accumulate in their entire careers. He went on to call 24 World Series total. Let that number sit for a sec. 24, that is a level of visibility that very few in any profession ever reach. But here is where it gets being the son of Jack Buck did not make things easier for Joe. It made them harder. When you walk into a room already carrying your father's father's legacy on your back. Every mistake gets magnified. Every criticism lands with extra weight. For Joe Buck, the loudest accusation at the very beginning was nepotism. People said he only got the job because of his last name. They said he was coasting on his father's reputation, and that charge followed him years and years. So what did Joe do about it? He went the opposite direction, pulled back, kept things flat and minimal, kept his energy deliberately low. He stopped himself from getting visibly excited at moments when excitement might look like hometown favorites. During the 2006 World Series, when the Cardinals won it all, he later admitted called the final moments artificial lack of enthusiasm. Not because he did not feel it, but because he was genuinely afraid of looking like he was rooting for his father's franchise on national television. Critics pounced on that approach and never let it go. His call of the helmet catch in the 2007 Super Bowl, when David Tyree made one of the most probable plays in NFL history, was barely more than two quiet words delivered in a flat tone. People were outraged. This was a once-in-a-lifetime moment, and the national voice sounded like he was watching ground out. That call became one of the most criticized moments in sports broadcasting history, and it handed ammunition to every fan who already believed Buck was emotionally absent at biggest stages. That criticism fed the broader narrative in a very damaging way. If Buck sounds bored during a Giants miracle, maybe he wanted the Patriots to win. Buck sounds flat during a Red Sox moment, maybe he is rooting against Boston. Fans filled in the blanks. They connect dots in whatever direction matched what they already believed. And the idea that Joe Buck hated their team or their specific player became something millions of people genuinely believed as settled. What was actually happening was something more complex. Buck was trapped, trying so hard not to appear biased that came across as emotionally disconnected. An emotional disconnection sports broadcasting reads as hostility to the people watching it. When the national voice does not celebrate the moment your team just had, fans do not interpret that as professionalism. They interpret it as the announcer being secretly against them. There is also a structure that made everything dramatically worse. During the regular season, fans consume games called by local broadcasters on regional sports networks. Those local voices are openly partisan. They validate the home team's success. They protect players from harsh public criticism. They build the mythology of the franchise night after night for 6 months straight. Then the postseason arrives. Local broadcasts go dark, and suddenly national news crews take over. That shift feels like whip. Buck talked about this directly. He said fans are simply their own announcers. And when a national voice treats both teams the same way, the home fan base hears that neutrality as the enemy. That is the Switzerland, a real psychological phenomenon with documented consequences. But understanding it does not make following cases easier to sit with, because in 7 very specific moments, Buck's words went beyond neutral, left last marks on real people. Let us start with number 7. Number 7, Kyle Schwarber, 2016 World Series. Chicago Cubs versus Cleveland Indians. This is the moment where fan frustration with Joe Buck hit its loudest and most creative peak, and it all centered on what started as a genuinely heartwarming story. Kyle Schwarber was a young player who had torn his ACL back in April of that year. The injury was so serious that everyone assumed his 2016 was completely done. He went through months of rehab, and then at the last moment, the Cubs activated him for the Fall Classic. It was a great story. A young player fighting back from a serious injury to the biggest stage of his sport. Buck latched onto that story immediately and simply did not let go. Every time Schwarber came to plate, the audience heard about the injury. Every at-bat was framed through the lens of his comeback. Every single plate appearance became another chapter in the Schwarber narrative. Cubs fans felt good. The national voice was telling their story the way they wanted it told. Problem was Cleveland. The Indians were in the World Series too. They had their own players, their own journeys, their own reasons to be proud of being there. And as the series progressed, Cleveland fans felt completely left out of their own product. They felt like the national coverage had already picked its heroes and written them out of the script. Their players were names in a box score. Cubs had the story, and the story only had room for one team. The frustration grew game by game. By the middle of the series, neutral noticing it too. The Schwarber coverage was not just a thread in the broadcast, it was the whole fabric. Sports fans have a finely tuned radar for when a broadcast chosen a side. And by the midpoint of 2016 World Series, a large portion of the viewing audience had concluded that Buck had absolutely made his choice and was not hiding it. The response from Cleveland fans pointed and genuinely clever. One fed-up fan set up a public wedding registry online. The listing was in the names of Joe Buck, Kyle Schwarber. It was a direct and unmistakable joke about the level of devotion Buck pouring into one player's coverage. The registry spread across sports media almost immediately. It became viral, and it stands today as one of the most memorable acts of broadcast protest in modern sports history. Buck was asked about the bias claims during the series. He pushed back firmly. He told fans to grow up and said he was simply doing his job by covering the most compelling storyline in the game. Strictly professional standpoint, he had a point. Schwarber's return was a real story worth covering, but there is a meaningful difference between covering a story and using it to colonize every available moment of a 7-game broadcast. And the argument against Buck here is that he crossed that line in 26 out and back. Here is the question that lingers after all. When a national broadcaster selects one storyline and hammers it relentlessly for an entire championship series, what happens to the other team in that? Cleveland had players who worked hard to get there. They had their own stories of struggle and perseverance, but those stories did not exist in the broadcast. And when the underdog mythology is already built entirely around the Cubs and their 108-year championship championship drought, the team they are playing starts to feel less like a legitimate contender, more like a set piece. That is what Buck's framing produced in 2016. Cleveland fans felt it deep. They have not forgotten. Now let us move to number 6. Number 6, Clayton Kershaw. This case is genuinely different from the others because Kershaw was not criticized or diminished. He was overpraised. And that might sound like a strange complaint to make, but stay with this because the effect on the broadcast and on Kershaw's reputation with opposing fans was during the 2016 postseason, the Dodgers faced the Cubs in National League Championship Series. Kershaw was the face of the Dodgers franchise. He was widely considered the best pitcher in baseball by any reasonable measure. He was already a living and Buck treated accordingly. The problem was that the coverage became obsessive to a degree that crowded out everything else. It did not matter who was actually pitching or hitting at any given moment. The broadcast always found its way back to Kershaw. If a Cubs hitter struck out, the conversation drifted toward Kershaw's statistics. If the Dodgers offense struggled, Buck would steer the discussion toward when Kershaw might pitch next and what that mean. If there was a quiet moment in the game, Kershaw's legacy filled the silence, his mechanics, his postseason history, his career numbers, place in the pantheon of great pitchers over and over, game after game. Cubs fans found this absolutely maddening. They were watching their team compete in a meaningful series, and the broadcast kept talking about someone who was not even on the field. Neutral fans started picking up on it too. Social media lit up with jokes about how often Kershaw's name was being said compared to any player who was actually actively involved in the game being played. It became a running commentary on the broadcast itself. Here is the real irony worth sitting with. Buck's excessive praise for Kershaw did not improve Kershaw's reputation opposing fans. It made things considerably worse. Because when a national broadcaster turns one player into the singular story of an entire postseason run, everything gets filtered through that framing after. When Kershaw pitched well, it felt like it was supposed to happen because of how much he had built up. When he struggled, the contrast felt especially harsh. Fans who had no prior reason to dislike Kershaw walked away from that series irritated by him instead of pressed. This is one of the most unusual forms of media damage a broadcast cause. It is not negative coverage. It is suffocation through excessive praise. The saturation creates backlash. Backlash lands on the player who did absolutely nothing to deserve it. Kershaw showed up, competed as hard as anyone could. The way Buck's broadcast packaged the 26 postseasons attached a negative feeling among fans who had never had any particular issue with him for that series. From a critical standpoint, this failure is hard to explain away cleanly. Buck had a full broadcast team around him. Producers, color commentators, directors. At some point in a professional operation, someone should have recognized the imbalance, pulled the coverage back toward equilibrium. The fact that it ran uncorrected through entire postseason suggests either a very deliberate editorial choice or a level of tunnel vision that failed the broadcast viewers. Either way, the effect was concrete. One player was suffocated by too much attention, while an entire opposing team was quietly erased from their own championship run. Now for number 5, Manny Ramirez. If you were a Red Sox fan during the peak Manny years, you already know exactly how this one played out. Manny Ramirez was one of the most gifted right-handed hitters to ever play the game of baseball. His offensive numbers are not a debate. His talent was not in question. In terms of pure hitting ability, Manny belonged in any conversation about the greatest batters of any era. But Joe Buck's national broadcast rarely led with that version of Manny Ramirez. What the broadcast focused on instead was the behavior, the eccentricity, the moments where Manny appeared lazy, checked out, the defensive lapses, the slow routes in the outfield, the cutoff men, the general sense of indifference that Manny sometimes projected when he's not at the plate. These were real things that genuinely happened. Buck did not invent them, but consistent return to them during the biggest national broadcasts built a very specific portrait of Manny Ramirez in the minds of casual fans. That portrait was a reduction. The phrase that stuck to Manny during that era was Manny being Manny. It became the stock explanation for anything strange or careless did. And national broadcasts under Buck leaned into that phrase in a way that slowly ground a Hall of Fame hitter down into a walking punchline. Every time something went sideways in the outfield or the dugout, the broadcast made it the central note of the coverage. Even during World Series games, even when the man was producing some of the most clutch at-bats of the entire postseason, Red Sox fans pushed back on this framing constantly as they felt it was fundamentally incomplete. Yes, Manny could be eccentric. Yes, there were moments where his effort in the out questionable. But the full picture of Manny Ramirez was a player who showed up moments mattered most. Player with a deep record of producing the biggest spots in the game. Player who helped make Boston most feared offensive lineups in baseball history. That side of the story got far less national airtime than character. There is a real question embedded here about what a broadcaster owes the audience. When you have one of the great hitters in baseball competing in a World Series, your job is to help people understand what they are watching, what makes this player historically significant, what this moment in context. If your coverage of that player is primarily about eccentricity and salary and soft effort in the outfield, you are reinforcing a stereotype rather than doing journalism. You are doing it to an audience of tens of millions who have no other frame of reference. The case against Buck here is clear. His framing of Manny Ramirez collapsed a genuinely complex player into a single unflattering note, and that note became the dominant story for the casual fans who had no deeper knowledge of Manny. They came away thinking lazy and overpaid. They did not come away thinking legendary postseason hitter and one of of the most feared bats of his generation. That imbalance is a choice made by the voice in the booth. And choices like that leave marks that stay attached to a player's name for a very long time. Number 4 carries the same kind of weight. Number 4, Yasiel Puig. If there was ever a player who represented the cultural divide inside baseball, Yasiel. He came from Cuba, played with tremendous emotion, played with flair for fire, flipped his bat, his arms wide after big catches. He celebrated in ways that old school baseball people found deeply unsettling. And in that era, Joe Buck's broadcast served as one of the loudest voices for the old school side of that argument. Buck's regular partner during much of his Fox coverage involving the Dodgers was John Smoltz. Smoltz is a Hall of Fame pitcher who understands the game at this level. And both Smoltz and Buck consistently critical of the way Puig played and carried himself on the field. The bat flips drew direct commentary. The unwritten rules violations sparked long discussion. The moments where Puig showed up the opposition or celebrated louder than tradition became broadcast talking points that returned again and again. Dodgers fans heard something very specific in all of that coverage. They heard two men from an older generation of the sport using a national platform to repeatedly tell the country that Yasiel Puig was a problem player, not an exciting star with a unique style. A problem. The language choices made all the difference. When a broadcaster frames a player's emotion as disrespect for the game, that framing accumulates over time. When a color commentator returns to unwritten rules every time a player gets a big hit or makes a great play, the audience gets conditioned to see that player through a lens of discipline and attitude rather than talent and production. By the middle of those seasons, the national narrative on Puig was not centered on his elect play. It was centered on whether he could grow up and get his act together. That was the story the casual national audience absorbed, and it had nothing to do with whether Yasiel Puig was actually a problem on the Dodgers. Dodgers fans who watched every single game knew what they had. They saw the power, the arm that made opposing runners think twice. They saw the impact he had on a lineup clubhouse. None of that translated through the national broadcast. There is a layer to this case that goes beyond traditionalism versus modern expression. When you consistently apply the unwritten rules framework to a player who comes from a different country and a different baseball culture, the argument starts to carry weight beyond pure style preferences. Dodgers fans believed it was institutional bias aimed at a player whose personality did not match the standard that the had decided was acceptable. Whether that belief is entirely fair or not, it was widely and genuinely held by the fan base that watched play every night. The result was a divide between local reality and national perception. At home, Puig was electric and beloved. Nationally, audiences saw someone with an attitude problem who could not follow the rules of the game. That gap between the two pictures was instructed almost entirely how the national broadcasts chose to frame his moments. Buck sat at the center of that coverage, and the label produced followed Puig throughout his career in ways he never fully escaped. Now here is number 3. Number 3, Pedro Martinez, 2003 American League Championship Series. One of the most iconic playoff series in baseball history. Red Sox versus Yankees. Game after game of real tension and genuine greatness. And at the center of it was Pedro Martinez, the most dominant pitcher of his entire era, and one of the most gifted arms in the history of the sport. But listening to Buck's coverage during that season, you might not have fully sensed what Pedro meant to that series or to the game. Criticism directed at Buck during the 2003 Alks arrived two separate directions. The first was boredom. Red Sox fans complained loudly that when Pedro was on the mound doing historic things, Buck sounded detached, flat, almost like he was somewhere else. There was a consistent absence of energy during Pedro's best stretches that fans read as a sign that the national voice was simply not appreciating what was happening in front of him. When you are watching one of the greatest pitchers alive operating at the very top of his game, you want the voice calling it to reflect magnitude moment. When it does not, the gap starts to feel intentional. The second direction was the brawl. Earlier in the series, a fight broke out on the field involving Kareem Garcia and eventually escalated to a famous moment where Pedro grabbed Yankees bench coach Don Zimmer and sent him to the ground. It was chaotic and emotionally charged. Buck went very heavy with disaster framing. His tone made the incident sound catastrophic, like something irreparable had occurred. And that framing put Pedro directly at the center of the controversy as the driving force behind chaos. Problem with that framing, fuller con, the 2003 Alks was an intensely charged series with decades-long history behind it. There were provoked actions on multiple sides. Things escalated the way they did because of events and tensions that ran much deeper than any single player. But the way Buck narrated the brawl funneled the weight of the situation onto Pedro specifically. Casual viewers who did not know the history came away with a clear takeaway. Pedro was the one who made things get out of hand. Combine that with the flatness during Pedro's dominant stretches and a consistent pictures. When Pedro was at his best, the broadcast was quiet. When the Yankees were coming back off a tiring Pedro in the late innings, the energy in the broadcast picked up noticeably. When the brawl happened, Pedro carried the framing as the central figure in the chaos. Taken together, these choices tell a story, and the story they tell positions the Red Sox ace consistent negative light for a national audience of tens of millions. Then came Game 7. Pedro fought brilliantly for 7 innings and was visibly running out of gas as he approached the 8th. Manager Grady Little left him in. The Yankees stormed back. And critics noted that Buck sounded more alive and engaged during that comeback than he had for any of Pedro's dominant moments earlier in the game. Red Sox fans heard the difference clearly and in real time. Whether Buck was consciously pulling for the Yankees or not, the emotional map of his broadcast during that series always seemed to run against the grain of what Boston was experiencing. And when 40 million people are listening, that matters more than we realize. Up next, Number 2, Barry Bonds. This case is personal, not just in the sense that fans took the coverage personally, but in the sense that Buck himself affirmed it was personal. In reflections he shared publicly, Buck talked openly about his relation to Bonds. He said Bonds blew him off regularly. He said Bonds was standoffish, surly, and ungrateful during their interactions. Bonds would not cooperate with pregame interviews, cultivated a deliberate wall between himself and media figures. And Joe Buck was one of the people on the wrong side of that wall for years. Now think carefully about what that means in practice. A broadcaster who has experienced openly hostile personal interaction player over multiple years is still expect to call that player's game complete professional neutrality. That is an extraordinarily difficult standard to meet. If someone treated you with consistent dismissal and disrespect every time your paths crossed, affect your perception of them. It would not necessarily make you dishonest on air, but it would color your framing. It would shape the emotional energy you brought narrating moments. And that is exactly what San Francisco Giants fans believed was happening whenever Buck called games where Bonds was involved. For years, Giants fans pointed to specific examples as evidence of anti-Bonds slant coverage. The call that came up most often was Game 7 of the 1992 National League Championship Series. Bonds made a poor defensive throw to home plate. The ball came in weak. Sid Bream scored. Pittsburgh Pirates were eliminated from the postseason. Buck's commentary on the play was pointed and direct, called out defensive failure clearly. And for fans who already suspected Buck had it out for Bonds, that call became a cornerstone piece of evidence in a larger case they had been building for years. What makes the Bonds case particularly layered is how complicated Bonds himself genuinely was. He was not easy. He was one of the most guarded and private athletes in professional sports. He had real reasons for his behavior that were rooted in years of being treated as a commodity rather than being. None of that excuses shutting out broadcasters or treating media figures with contempt, but it gives real texture to why the relationship between Bonds and the national media was so fractured across the. Buck had the right to call what he saw on the field accurately. Bonds made a bad throw. Describing it as a bad throw is journalism, not bias. But the broader tone of how Buck's broadcast felt to Giants fans, of course, many years went beyond single plays and single calls. Feeling that when Bonds came to the plate or made a big play, commentary carried an edge that fans of other superstars simply did not experience when their guys were highlighted. And when Buck himself affirmed that his personal relationship with Bonds was genuinely cold and difficult, the fan accusations became much harder to simply wave away. The most charitable reading is unconscious bias born from real personal friction. Either way, the result was years of national coverage that Giants fans experienced as an ongoing injustice. And now, the last one. Number one, Oscar Taveras. This is the heaviest case on the entire list, not just of what was said on air, but because of everything that came after. In August 2014, Buck was behind the microphone for a nationally televised Saturday broadcast on Fox Sports. The Cardinals had recently completed a significant and controversial trade, sending popular veteran Alan Craig to the Boston Red Sox. The reason for that trade was to open a full-time starting spot for the most prized prospect, 22-year-old outfielder from the Dominican Republic named Oscar Taveras. The expectations around him were generational. The organization had built real plans around this young man. But during that August broadcast, Buck reported something that changed the conversation around Taveras immediately, and he said members of the Cardinals clubhouse were deeply dissatisfied with Taveras and work habits. Not mildly concerned, genuinely upset, Buck reported that Taveras had declined to show up for early batting practice and other veteran preparations clubhouse considered non-negotiable. And then Buck went further. He made the specific point that this kind of behavior would never been tolerated under Albert Pujols. He used one of the most sacred names in Cardinals history to make the criticism land as hard as possible. The backlash was fast and loud. Fans were upset that a national broadcast was being used as a platform to publicly question the character and work ethic of a 22-year-old prospect. Even if the clubhouse information was accurate and came from legitimate internal sources, the decision to bring it onto a live national broadcast during a game was a deliberate editorial choice. Buck had the information. He chose to put it on the air. He chose to frame it the way he did. And framing a young player's professional character against the standard set by a franchise legend is not a neutral act. This matters. The criticism Buck delivered was not about performance. It's not about strikeout rate or on-base on-base percentage or anything measurable. It was about who Oscar Taveras was as a person, professional. It was about his willingness to put in the work, his attitude, commitment to the game. And once a narrative like that goes out on a national broadcast in front of millions of viewers, the player cannot simply step plate and answer it with a statistic. The story exists independently of anything he does on field. 2 months after that broadcast, Oscar Taveras was killed in an automobile accident in the Dominican Republic. 22 years old, he died during the World Series. During Game 5 of the Fall Classic, Ken Rosenthal delivered the news from the dugout on a live broadcast. He was visibly shaken. The sport stopped and sat with that moment in silence. And in that moment, the August broadcast where Buck had publicly reported on Taveras' work habits and compared him unfavorably to Pujols became something permanently different from what it had been. It became the last major national story told about Oscar Taveras as a person. It became the frame through which many people first countered his name at all. The final public picture of a young man who never got the chance to answer his critics on the field or prove anything to anyone. There is no clean answer to whether Buck crossed a line with that. Clubhouse information is genuinely part of baseball journalism landscape. Honest coverage sometimes means saying things that are uncomfortable, but the question of whether a national game broadcast is the right place to publicly damage the character reputation of a young prospect using the most respected name in that franchise's history to underscore the point is one that resists a simple resolution. And the tragedy that followed ensures it will never fully be resolved. Oscar Taveras deserved more than one story. He deserved the chance to play his way into a different narrative. He never got that chance. And that silence sits at the center of this case permanently. The 7 baseball cases do not exist in isolation. They connect to a broader pattern that shows up across everything Buck is called. In 2005, during an NFL wildcard game with Viking Packers, Randy Moss scored a touchdown and walked to the goalpost, pretending to pull his pants down to mock the Green Bay crowd. Buck responded immediately and with intense moral disapproval, called it a disgusting act and expressed regret that it had aired on television. The reaction dramatically out of proportion what actually happened, and it launched a national conversation about Moss that carried racially loaded undertones in how the broader sports media picked it up and ran with it. Buck later admitted he genuinely believed from his press box angle that Moss had actually exposed himself to the crowd, explained his level of visible panic during an era of very tight live broadcast regulations following a major prior incident. He said he would handle the call differently given the chance. But the disgusting act label had already spread everywhere and stuck to Moss in ways that outlasted any correction. A similar pattern unfolded in December of 2021 when Charger tight end Donald Parham Jr. collapsed on the field after a severe head impact. His arms stiff, his body showed the unmistakable neurological signs of a serious traumatic brain injury. And in that moment, Buck suggested to a concerned viewing audience that cold weather in Los Angeles might be responsible for what they were seeing, proposing that a player showing severe brain trauma symptoms was perhaps just cold in an indoor stadium was immediately and widely condemned by medical professionals. The founder and CEO of the Concussion Legacy Foundation called it rock bottom for sports broadcasting. These moments reveal a consistent tendency. When Buck moves faster than the full picture is available, consequences fall hard on the bull in the story. But there is another side to that same verbal power worth acknowledging. During a December 2021 appearance on S-Ben's Manningcast, Buck waited for the perfect moment and delivered a reference to the Seattle Seahawks' historically brutal demolition of Peyton Manning's Denver Broncos in Super Bowl XLVI. The line was sharp, perfectly placed, and immediately viral. The same voice that caused damage in other moments showed here exactly how precisely deploy words when the conditions were right. That tension between recklessness and precision runs through his entire career. So where does all of this leave us? Joe Buck is now a Hall of Fame broadcaster. The Ford C. Frick Award is one of the highest honors this sport can bestow. He called 24 World Series. He grew from a flat and guarded announcer fighting the shadow of his father's legacy into one of the most expressive and celebrated voices in the game. The David Freese moment in 2011, the Travis Ishikawa walk-off 2014, final out of the 2006 Cubs World Series, those calls belong to baseball history now. They will be heard and played as long as you love this sport. They show what Buck is capable of when everything aligns. The 7 cases in this video are also, they show a broadcaster power to shape national narratives around football and a track record of sometimes using that power in ways that were difficult to justify. A young player's character attacked publicly before the world. A complex superstar reduced to an unflattering caricature. Passion outfielder labeled as undisciplined and respectful. An entire city's team made invisible during their own championship. A broadcaster's personal friction with a legend quietly bleeding into years of coverage. These are not minor footnotes. They matter to ball. The honest truth about Joe Buck is that he is both of these things at the same time. Great calls and damaging ones, the sharp intelligence and the occasional carelessness, the Hall of Fame legacy and the long trail of controversy. That tension is exactly what makes his career one of the most genuinely fascinating stories in sports media. Drop a comment below and tell us which of these 7 cases you think was the most unfair to the player involved. If you are not subscribed yet, right now is a great time to take care of that.